At 69 years old, Odessa Whitlock thought she had already survived the worst that life could ever hand her. She had buried her husband, Wendell, 3 winters ago. She had buried her only daughter, Colette, in a January so cold she still could not bring herself to say the word black ice out loud. And somehow, through all of it, she had found the strength to raise her 16-year-old grandson Micah on a modest pension, a garden full of tomatoes, and a stubborn kind of love that refused to quit. But the cruelest betrayal of her life was still waiting for her, and it did not come from fate or illness or a stranger behind a wheel. It came from family. In a single afternoon inside a mahogany-paneled courtroom in Montpelier, Vermont, her late husband's own brother stripped her of the farmhouse she had lived in for 38 years, the quiet savings Wendell had set aside for Micah's future, and every single piece of security she believed was protected by blood and by promises made at a hospital bedside. Malcolm Whitlock used silver-tongued lawyers and cold, calculated maneuvers, and when the gavel came down, Odessa walked out of that courtroom with 2 suitcases, a grieving teenager, and legal ownership of the only property Malcolm considered beneath his interest, a collapsing watermill on the forgotten edge of a village called Hollowbrook. No electricity, no running water, just rot, moss, a shattered water wheel, and a roof that had surrendered to the Vermont sky 2 decades earlier. Malcolm laughed out loud when he signed those papers. He thought he had buried Odessa in the most worthless corner of the map, but he made a terrible, expensive mistake. He underestimated a 69-year-old grandmother who had nothing left to lose except a boy who still looked at her like she was carved out of steel. And he never, ever imagined what Wendell's great-uncle Ambrose had sealed beneath the rotting floorboards of that mill. Something that, exactly 3 days after Odessa arrived, would strike Malcolm's empire like lightning and burn it straight down to the foundations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On that cold, damp morning in Hollowbrook, surrounded by villagers who whispered pity behind lace curtains and shopkeepers who lowered their voices when she walked past, Odessa had to start over from absolute zero. She had to be strong when she wanted to collapse onto the wet grass. She had to scrub rotten beams when her hands were already bleeding. She had to smile for Micah when all she really wanted to do was cry quietly in the bathroom of a closed-down gas station. And it was while she was trying to seal a crack in that rotten mill floor, trying to keep the December wind from reaching her grandson, that Odessa found something that would change everything. It wasn't just a hidden vault. It was proof that sometimes the universe hides its greatest treasures in exactly the places cruel men throw the women they believe they've destroyed. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who shared your last name, if you've ever had to put on a brave face for a child while your own world was silently shattering, if you've ever been underestimated by the very people who should have stood beside you, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age, where we prove that starting over at 60, 70, or beyond isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of the best revenge there is, living well. Get ready, because the ruined, trash Malcolm threw Odessa into became the empire that cracked his pride clean in half. And the woman he thought he'd buried on the edge of nowhere, she was only being planted. Odessa Marie Whitlock was 24 years old this summer. She met Wendell Whitlock at a small county fair in western Vermont. She was running the library's book donation booth, sunburned and stubborn and tired of the heat, and he was the quiet man with kind brown eyes who bought every single paperback she had left at the end of the day, not because he wanted a single one of them, but because he wanted an excuse to keep talking to her. They were married 11 months later in a little white church with borrowed peonies and a veil her mother had worn in 1958. Wendell was a carpenter, not a famous one, not a rich one, just a man who built things that lasted. Kitchen tables, church pews, the wide oak staircase of their own farmhouse at 14, Hollow Ridge Road in Asheboro, Vermont. Odessa taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 towns over for 29 years, and she loved almost every single day of it. They had 1 daughter, Colette, born in 1984, a bright, spinning, freckled little bird of a girl who laughed exactly like her father and argued exactly like her mother. For 3 full decades, life was simple, and it was good. They were never wealthy, but they were careful. Wendell saved every spare dollar he could into a separate account he called, with that slow, warm smile of his, Micah's ladder, the college fund for their grandson, the one promise he was still talking about on the afternoon he passed. That was what Malcolm came for, 3 months after the funeral. The ladder. And Odessa, with her guard down and her grief still raw, never saw him climbing it until it was already gone. Malcolm Whitlock had always been the charming brother. Wendell was the quiet one, the steady one, the one who showed up at 4 in the morning to help a neighbor pull a calf. Malcolm was the handsome one in the tailored coat, the one who moved to Boston at 22 and came back every Christmas with expensive wine and stories that were always slightly too polished to be fully true. He had made his money in commercial real estate, or so the family believed, and for nearly 4 decades, nobody in Hollow Ridge ever pressed him too hard on the specifics. He was family. That was enough. Wendell had trusted him completely. And that trust, that one small, unquestioned thing, was the crack Malcolm spent years quietly prying open. 3 weeks before Wendell died in the hospice wing of the regional hospital, he asked Malcolm to sit with him alone. Odessa stepped out to get coffee. When she came back, Malcolm was holding Wendell's hand, and Wendell was crying softly, and Malcolm was nodding and saying the words that Odessa would replay inside her head for years afterward. I'll take care of her, and I swear on Mama. I'll take care of Odessa and Micah like they were my own. Odessa had believed him. In the worst, most hollowed-out week of her life, she had signed papers Malcolm brought her in a soft leather folder. Power of attorney forms, executor documents, transfer authorizations, barely reading them, trusting the brother of the man she was about to bury. Malcolm had kissed her forehead and told her not to worry about a single thing. For about 2 years, she didn't. Malcolm paid the property taxes. Malcolm handled the paperwork. Malcolm called once a month to ask how Micah was doing in school, and he always signed off with the same warm line, "You just focus on that boy, OD, I've got the rest of it." And Odessa, wrapped in grief, and then wrapped again in the fresh agony of losing Colette on that black ice highway outside of Bar the following January, let him handle it. What choice did she have? She was raising a 13-year-old boy whose mother had just been killed and whose father had vanished back to Moldova years before any of them had even met him. She was cooking dinners she couldn't taste. She was sleeping 4 hours a night. She was surviving. And while she was surviving, Malcolm was working. The truth came out on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, 6 months before her 69th birthday. Odessa had walked into the Ashboro branch of the community bank to withdraw $300 from Micah's school supplies, and a young teller, a polite boy named Travis who had been in her 3rd grade class 15 years earlier, looked at a screen, frowned, and then quietly asked her to wait for the manager. The manager, a woman named Geneva Holloway, who would later become one of the most important people in Odessa's life, came out from the back office with a folder in her hands and a look of controlled, careful dread on her face. "Mrs. Whitlock," she said, very gently, "I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. Your accounts were closed in August. All of them. The transfers were authorized by the estate executor. I'm so sorry. I assumed you knew." Odessa did not know. Odessa had not, in fact, known a single thing. The savings account Wendell had built for Micah over 31 years, $186,000, every penny of it, had been moved to a trust Odessa had never heard of, managed by a law firm she had never hired, controlled by a man who shared her last name by marriage and nothing else. The farmhouse at 14, Hollow Ridge Road, the one Wendell had built with his own 2 hands, had been quietly refinanced and then transferred into a limited liability company registered to a Boston address. Odessa's name had been removed from the deed during a refinancing she had signed inside that soft leather folder 2 years earlier. On the same afternoon, she had signed the grocery list for her husband's memorial reception. Malcolm had taken everything, cleanly, legally, patiently, with the same slow, careful hands Wendell had once trusted to hold his at the end. Odessa drove home that afternoon in complete silence. Micah was at baseball practice. The kitchen still smelled like the rosemary bread she had baked that morning. She sat at the oak table Wendell had built for her the summer Colette was born, and she did not cry. Not yet. She called Malcolm's cell phone 17 times. He did not answer. At 9:41 p.m., he finally sent a text message. OD, come to my office in Boston Friday. We need to talk. Bring a lawyer if you want. Love, M. The casual cruelty of the word love at the bottom of that message was the thing that finally broke her. Odessa sat in the dark kitchen for a long time with the phone glowing in her hand. Then she stood up, walked upstairs, looked in on her sleeping grandson, and quietly began to plan. The lawyer Odessa found in Ashboro was a soft-spoken man nearing retirement who did his absolute best, but he was overmatched the moment he stepped into that Montpelier courtroom. Malcolm's legal team was led by a man named Reginald Thorne, silver-haired, 61, with a voice that sounded like expensive bourbon poured slowly over ice. Thorne had spent 30 years building a specialty in estate litigation, and he had prepared for this hearing the way a general prepares for a battle he has already won on paper. Malcolm sat behind his attorney in a charcoal suit that cost more than Odessa's monthly pension, and beside him sat his wife Priscilla, 54, blonde, impeccable, wearing a single strand of pearls and the faintly bored expression of a woman who had already mentally redecorated the farmhouse. The hearing lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Thorne produced every document Odessa had signed inside that soft leather folder. He produced a notarized executor authorization. He produced bank transfers Odessa had technically, legally, consented to. He produced a refinancing agreement with her own signature at the bottom, dated 6 days after Wendell's funeral. He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. The judge, a tired woman in her late 50s, looked at Odessa with something that was almost pity, and then ruled, slowly and carefully, that the documents were valid, the transfers were lawful, and that Mrs. Whitlock had, by her own hand, relinquished claim to the contested properties and accounts. Odessa lost everything. The farmhouse, the college fund, the savings, the life insurance, every single piece of ground that Wendell had put beneath her feet over 38 years. Her attorney, trying to salvage anything at all, asked that at least one asset be reserved for her, a small property that had appeared on an older schedule of Wendell's family holdings but had never once been mentioned in the proceedings. A watermill on a patch of land just outside a village called Hollowbrook, originally owned by Wendell's great-uncle Ambrose Whitlock. Malcolm's lawyer actually laughed out loud. An honest, surprised laugh. "Your Honor," Thorne said, smiling, "my client has no objection. That property is structurally condemned. It has no utilities. It sits on land that floods every spring. The demolition costs alone exceed its assessed value. If Mrs. Whitlock wants it, she is welcome to it. We consider it a gift." Malcolm signed the transfer paperwork at the clerk's desk 20 minutes later. As he handed the pen back, he looked at Odessa for the first time all day and said very quietly, "Enjoy the mill, OD." Wendell used to call it the rot heap. Then he walked out of the courthouse with Priscilla on his arm. Odessa drove home that evening without speaking. Micah was waiting at the kitchen table with a plate of cold spaghetti he had made himself, his school backpack still on the chair beside him, his eyes already red from a day of guessing. She sat down across from him and told him the truth, all of it, in one long, flat, steady voice. The house would have to be vacated in 30 days. There was no savings left. There was no college fund. There was a watermill in a place she had never been, and that was all they had. Micah listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up, walked around the table, wrapped his arms around her shoulders, and said very quietly, "Then we go to the mill, Nana. We figure it out. He can't take it away. It's ours." 3 weeks later, they packed what fit into Wendell's old green Ford Ranger, the one truck Malcolm had forgotten to list as an asset because it was 22 years old and held together with faith, and they drove north through the mountains. Hollowbrook, Vermont, was not on most maps. It was a single curve of road tucked between two ridges of pine, with a covered bridge, a general store, a post office the size of a tool shed, and maybe 60 permanent residents who all knew each other's grandparents. Jonas Pritchard, a weathered 74-year-old mechanic who ran the only garage in town, met them at the general store when they stopped to ask directions. He looked at the address on Odessa's paperwork, and his face did a slow, careful thing. "Ambrose Whitlock's old mill," he said quietly. Nobody set foot on that property in near 20 years, ma'am. I don't want to discourage you, but that place isn't fit to keep a dog in. Odessa lifted her chin. We'll make it fit, she said. Jonas nodded once, climbed into his own truck without another word, and led them down a narrow dirt road along Blackwater Creek, through a tunnel of overgrown birches, to the place Malcolm had called the rot heap. When Odessa saw it, her last small piece of hope closed its eyes. The Watermill was worse than anything Odessa had let herself imagine on the long drive north. It squatted at the edge of Blackwater Creek like a wounded animal that had crawled into the trees to die 20 years ago and been forgotten. The main building was maybe 600 square feet of hand-cut stone and rotted timber, 2 stories tall on the creek side, where the great wooden water wheel still clung to its rusted iron axle, though half the paddles had rotted clean through and the wheel itself was locked solid with moss, ivy, and a bird's nest the size of a dinner plate. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired back. 2 of the 4 windows were gone entirely, just empty sockets staring out at the water. The front door hung on one hinge and had a soft green fur of mildew growing down its center panel. Vines had pulled one entire corner of the stone foundation loose, and a young birch tree had taken root directly in the threshold, growing up through the doorway as if the forest had already decided the building belonged to it. Micah set his duffel bag down on the wet gravel and did not say anything for a long time. Then, very quietly, he said, "Nana, we can't live here." Odessa swallowed hard and forced her voice to stay level. "We have to, sweetheart. There's nowhere else." She unlocked the door with the ancient iron key the county clerk had handed her in a brown envelope, and the smell that rolled out of the mill was the smell of 2 decades of abandonment. Mold, wet stone, mouse droppings, rotting grain, and the faint, sour ghost of old linseed oil. The interior was a single large grinding room on the lower level, with the massive circular millstones still sitting silent at the center like 2 sleeping animals, and a narrow ladder climbing up to a loft that she did not, at first glance, trust with her weight. There was no plumbing. There was no electricity. There was a cast-iron stove in the corner that looked as though it had not been lit since the Reagan administration. After legal fees, the drive, and a tank of gas, Odessa had $612 to her name. Micah had $140 in birthday money folded into the front pocket of his wallet. That was what stood between the 2 of them and the Vermont winter. They slept that first night on inflatable camping mattresses in the driest corner of the grinding room, wrapped in every blanket they had brought, and Odessa listened to the creek running 6 feet from the wall and to her grandson's quiet, careful breathing, and did not allow herself to cry until she was absolutely certain he was asleep. The next morning, she walked the mile back into the village at first light and began the slow, humiliating work of surviving. At Geneva Holloway's general store, Geneva was the same bank manager from Ashboro, Odessa would later learn, who had moved back to her home village after her own husband passed 2 years earlier. Odessa counted every penny. Plastic sheeting for the windows, $18. Duct tape, $9. A second-hand kerosene heater from the back shelf, $45. Candles, oil, matches, a broom, bleach, rat traps, oatmeal, peanut butter, the cheapest bread on the rack. Geneva watched her count her dollar bills twice, then quietly slid a bag of apples and a wedge of cheddar across the counter without ringing them up. "Ambrose used to bring me peppermints when I was a little girl," she said softly, not meeting Odessa's eyes. "You take care of that boy. You come back here whenever you need to, and you don't worry about the rest. Nobody in Hollowbrook lets people go cold." Odessa had to turn and face the window, so Geneva would not see her cry. The gossip, of course, started immediately. She heard it every time she walked the village road. "That's the widow Malcolm Whitlock dumped out here. Can you imagine? Her own brother-in-law took the house right out from under her. 69 years old and living in Ambrose's mill. That roof won't hold through December. Poor thing. And that grandson, what happens to him?" The pity was, in its own way, worse than the cold. For 2 days, Odessa and Micah worked from first light to full dark. They hauled water from the creek in plastic jugs. They nailed plastic sheeting over the empty windows. They swept 2 decades of leaves and droppings out the door. They scrubbed the iron stove until Odessa's palms were bleeding through the cotton glove Geneva had pressed into her hand. At night, they ate oatmeal by candlelight and spoke very little. Micah's hands, which had spent 16 years holding pencils and baseball bats, were blistered raw by the end of the second day. He never once complained. Odessa watched him sleeping that second night and promised herself, in a voice she did not say out loud, that somehow, some way, she was going to build this boy a future, even if it killed her. She had no idea that the future was already there. 6 feet below the floor she was standing on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third morning at Whitlock's mill arrived under a low, iron-gray sky, and the first thing Odessa noticed when she stepped outside to fetch water was that the air had that specific still, heavy quality that every Vermonter learns to recognize by the time they're 6 years old. A storm was coming. Not a squall. A real one. By the time she climbed back up the creek bank with her 2 jugs, Jonas Pritchard's dented blue truck was already parked in the gravel, and Jonas himself was standing on the stone step of the mill with a weather radio in his hand and a concerned look on his weathered face. "Nor'easter coming in tonight, ma'am," he said without preamble. "Winds over 50. Could be worse. That roof of yours ain't going to hold. You and the boy need to come into the village, sleep at the store, at Geneva's, at my place, I don't care where, but not here." Odessa thanked him. She told him she would think about it. She did not, in fact, intend to think about it at all. She could not afford to lose 3 days of work to a storm. She sent Jonas on his way with a quiet promise to be careful. And then she and Micah went back inside to try to seal the mill as tightly as they could before the weather turned. It was Micah who found it first. He had been working in the far northeast corner of the grinding room, trying to stuff rags and old newspaper into a wide gap along the baseboard where the cold was pouring in, when he suddenly stopped, sat back on his heels, and said, "Nana, look at this floor." Odessa came over with the lantern. The flooring in the grinding room was old pine plank, worn silver gray with age and water and 130 years of ground flour, and every single board was the same, except for a rectangular section of about 4 feet by 6 feet directly beneath the northeast window. Those boards were darker, denser, heavier looking, fitted together with a precision the rest of the floor did not have. Black oak, she realized slowly. Somebody had pulled up a section of the original pine and replaced it with expensive black oak at least 80 or 90 years ago, and then sanded it down so it blended in with age. You would not notice it in daylight. You would not notice it in a hurry. But with the lantern raking sideways across the grain, it was as clear as a scar. Odessa pressed down on the center of the section with the heel of her hand. The boards gave just slightly under her weight. They were not rotten. They were loose, deliberately loose, like a lid. She and Micah looked at each other for one long, still second. Then Odessa went to the corner where she had stacked the few tools Jonas had lent her and came back with a flat pry bar. The first board came up so easily it almost fell into her hands. The second one did the same. Beneath them, instead of the dirt crawl space or stone footing she expected to see, there was a second layer of floor, a sealed wooden hatch, fitted with 2 heavy iron rings and a pair of leather straps so brittle they crumbled the moment her fingers touched them. Micah helped her lift the hatch free. Underneath was a chamber. It was small, perhaps 4 feet deep, 5 feet wide, lined on all 4 sides with dry stone and sealed at the bottom with a slab of slate. It was bone dry. Whoever had built it to last. And sitting in the exact center of the slate floor, wrapped in oiled canvas and tied with wax cord, was a flat rectangular case about the size of a large Bible, and beside it a heavy iron-banded wooden strongbox roughly the size of a toaster oven, padlocked with a serious old brass lock that was green with age but still clearly, absolutely intact. Odessa sat back on her heels on the cold floor of the mill her brother-in-law had laughed about, and she felt something move through her chest that she had not felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly. Something colder and sharper than hope. A kind of knowing. Micah, very quietly, whispered, "Nana, what is this?" Odessa did not answer. She reached down and lifted the canvas-wrapped case out of the chamber with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She set it carefully on the mill floor and began, with slow, steady fingers that were not shaking at all, to untie the wax cord. And at that exact hour, 170 miles south in a glass-walled office on the 22nd floor of a building in downtown Boston, two federal agents in dark coats were walking, unannounced, into Malcolm Whitlock's reception area with a sealed warrant in a manila folder. The canvas fell away in Odessa's hands like the petals of something that had been waiting a very long time to open. Inside the flat case, wrapped in a second layer of oiled linen, was a leather portfolio embossed with the initials H.W., Ambrose Hollis Whitlock. Odessa set it on the floor with the same careful reverence she had once used to handle her grandmother's Bible, and she opened it. The first document was a patent, a United States patent numbered and sealed and dated March 11th, 1914, issued to Ambrose H. Whitlock of Hollowbrook, Vermont, for an improvement to the mechanical milling apparatus relating to grain separation and centrifugal refinement. Odessa did not understand, in that moment, what she was looking at. But beneath the patent was a second patent from 1921, and a third from 1927. And behind those, in neat chronological order, were licensing agreements, dozens of them, between Ambrose Whitlock and a company called Northfield Grain and Milling, dated from 1923 through 1958. And beneath those, stacks and stacks of quarterly royalty statements, corporate correspondence, share certificates, and a handwritten ledger in Ambrose's own careful copperplate script. And beneath all of that, at the very bottom of the portfolio, was a letter. It was addressed, in faded blue ink, to whoever finds this, long after I am gone. Odessa read it aloud to Micah in a voice that grew steadier with every line. If you are reading this, I am dead, and the mill has finally given up its secret. My name is Ambrose Whitlock. I never married. I had no children. I spent my life on three things: this mill, this creek, and the machines I designed inside these walls. The patents in this case were the work of my hands. The company that licensed them, Northfield Grain and Milling, became very large in my lifetime, and I was paid fairly. But I never cared for money the way other men did. I lived simply because the work was the treasure. The shares I accumulated and the royalties that still flow from the patents, I have left in trust to whichever member of the Whitlock family eventually finds them. If that person is in need, let this be their rescue. If that person is cruel, let the law find them instead. I have left instructions with a firm in Montpelier. The name and address are enclosed. God keep you. Ambrose H. Whitlock, October 1961. The enclosed card was faded but legible. Park & Associates, Estate and Fiduciary Law, 47 Pine Street, Montpelier, Vermont. Odessa sat on the cold floor of the mill with the letter in her hands, and the storm Jonas had warned her about arrived outside the windows as if on cue, and she began to laugh. It was not a happy laugh at first. It was the laugh of a woman who had been underestimated so thoroughly, so completely, for so long, that her body simply did not know any other way to release what was rising inside her chest. She and Micah rode out the nor'easter in Geneva Holloway's spare bedroom that night, after Jonas Pritchard came back at dusk and physically refused to leave the mill without them. Odessa did not tell Geneva or Jonas what she had found. Not yet. She needed to be certain first. 3 days later, once the roads were passable, she borrowed Jonas's truck and drove to Montpelier. Park & Associates was no longer the small firm Ambrose had known in 1961. The original partners had long since passed, but the practice had been continued by a granddaughter named Delaney Park, 34 years old, sharp as a filleting knife, with her grandfather's original client files still archived in a basement room. When Odessa laid Ambrose's portfolio on her desk, Delaney Park went very still for a full 30 seconds. Then she quietly stood up, closed her office door, and asked her assistant to hold all her calls for the rest of the afternoon. The verification took 4 weeks. Delaney contacted Northfield Grain and Milling, which no longer existed under that name. It had merged in 1987 with 2 larger agricultural firms to form a public company now traded on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker NFAG, one of the 3 largest grain and food processing corporations in North America. Ambrose's original patents had been foundational to the company's refinement technology and had never been allowed to expire under standard licensing. They had been extended and folded into a perpetual royalty agreement that was still generating income. His share position, carried faithfully through every merger and stock split, now represented, at current market valuation, approximately $412 million in common stock, plus an accumulated royalty trust of a little over $71 million that had been sitting untouched in an escrow account at a Montpelier bank since 1983, waiting for the rightful Whitlock heir to come and claim it. Delaney Park called Odessa into her Montpelier office on a Thursday morning in late December, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished walnut desk, and said, very quietly, "Mrs. Whitlock, everything has been verified. Every signature, every transfer, every share. You are the sole living Whitlock heir named in Ambrose's trust. The assets are yours, unconditionally, legally, and completely." Odessa read the sheet twice. She read it a third time. Then she set it down on the desk, folded her hands in her lap, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to cry properly. Not the careful, private tears she had learned to muffle into pillows at 3 in the morning, but full, open, body-shaking weeping. Delaney did not say a word. She simply pushed a box of tissues across the desk and waited, with the patient stillness of a woman who had clearly sat with many other people through many other reversals of fortune, and who understood that some moments did not require anything at all except the dignity of silence. What Delaney told her next was that Malcolm already knew. He had known, in fact, for almost a full week. The federal agents who had walked into Malcolm's Boston office on the afternoon of day 3 had been investigating him for nearly 2 years on an entirely separate matter. A layered commercial real estate fraud involving forged appraisals, misrepresented collateral, and the systematic looting of 3 family trusts, one of which belonged to an elderly widow in Cambridge who had finally, 6 months earlier, hired a forensic accountant. The warrant served that afternoon had frozen Malcolm's personal and corporate accounts, seized his records, and placed him under an indictment that carried, at the low end of the sentencing range, 11 years in federal prison. His name had been on the front page of the Boston Globe business section the following Monday. His firm had collapsed inside a week. Priscilla had filed for legal separation by the following Friday. Not out of principle, Delaney noted dryly, but because the federal asset freeze had reached the joint accounts she had spent 30 years assuming were bottomless. And now, on top of all of that, the assets Malcolm believed he had successfully stripped from his brother's widow were being legally traced, valued, and reclaimed, not by the federal government, but by Odessa herself. Delaney had already filed the motion. The farmhouse on Hollow Ridge Road, Micah's college fund, the life insurance, the refinanced equity. Every dollar Malcolm had moved through documents Odessa had signed in grief was now subject to a civil claim of undue influence and fraudulent executor conduct, filed by an attorney who had the original Whitlock family trust documents in her basement archive and who could prove, line by line, that Malcolm had never had the authority he claimed. Reginald Thorne, Malcolm's silver-tongued attorney from the Montpelier hearing, withdrew from representation within 48 hours of being served. A junior public offender was appointed in his place. The civil rulings came fast. The farmhouse was restored to Odessa's name before the first crocus came up in the garden Wendell had planted for her in 1987. Malcolm tried to contact her exactly once. It was a letter handwritten on yellow legal paper, forwarded through Delaney's office in early February. Odessa read it alone at Geneva Holloway's kitchen table with a cup of black coffee in her hand. Malcolm wrote that he was sorry, that he had lost his way, that the pressure of his business had made him do things he never meant to do, that Wendell would be ashamed of him, that he understood, now, what he had taken, and that he was begging, truly begging, for her to consider writing a letter to the sentencing judge on his behalf. Family, he wrote, was the only thing that mattered in the end. Odessa read the letter all the way through. She folded it back into its envelope. She drank the rest of her coffee. Then she took a clean sheet of paper from Geneva's kitchen drawer, and in her careful third-grade teacher's handwriting, she wrote her reply. Malcolm, Wendell asked you to take care of me. You're not family. Family is the boy asleep upstairs, and the woman who gave me apples when I had nothing, and the old mechanic who would not leave me alone in a storm. You are a stranger who used my husband's last breath as a signature. I will not be writing to the judge. I hope prison is quiet. I hope you have a very long time to think about what you threw away. Odessa. She sealed the envelope. She mailed it herself the next morning from the Hollowbrook post office, and she never thought about Malcolm Whitlock in any serious way again. The villain had collapsed. The karma promised by her title had arrived on schedule, and it had arrived from two directions at once. Through federal agents in Boston and through an old patent in a stone chamber beneath a forgotten Vermont mill. Odessa did not move back into the farmhouse at 14 Hollow Ridge Road. She thought about it for a long time. She drove down to Ashboro one afternoon in April and stood in the front yard for almost an hour, looking at the oak Wendell had planted the year Colette was born and at the porch where she had shelled peas every summer for 38 years. The new owners had not moved in yet. The civil ruling had cleared the property back in her name only 6 weeks earlier, and the house sat empty in the soft spring light, its blue shutters still the color she had painted them the summer before Wendell got sick. She walked up the porch steps. She put her hand on the front door. She stood there for a long time with her forehead resting against the wood, listening for something she could not quite name, and eventually she understood that the thing she was listening for was not going to answer. Wendell was not inside that house. Wendell had not been inside that house for 3 years. Wendell was in the oak tree, and in the staircase he had built, and in the small scar on her left thumb from the afternoon, they had hung the kitchen cabinets together in 1989, and in the shape of their grandson's quiet, considering face when he was trying to solve a problem. The farmhouse was just a building. A beautiful building, a beloved building, but a building. Home, she realized, standing there on that porch, was wherever Wendell's people still needed her to be. And Wendell's people, as far as she could tell, were now gathered in a small Vermont village along a creek called Blackwater. She got back in the truck and drove home to Hollowbrook. She sold the farmhouse quietly the following month to a young couple from Montpelier who had 2 small children and who cried, both of them, when she handed them the keys. She put every dollar from the sale into the trust she had asked Delaney Park to build for her, a trust she named, after a great deal of thought and one long conversation with Geneva Holloway at the kitchen table, the Ambrose Whitlock Heritage Foundation. The foundation was not extravagant. Odessa did not want extravagance. She had watched, over the course of that long autumn and winter, what extravagance had done to Malcolm, and she had decided, with the same quiet, stubborn clarity she had once used to decide whether a third grader needed a firm hand or a soft one, that she was not going to let a single dollar of Ambrose's legacy make her into a smaller version of herself. She hired a small, respectful restoration firm out of Burlington run by a woman named Harriet Ashworth, who had spent 22 years restoring 19th-century industrial buildings across New England. Together, they spent 8 careful months bringing the mill back to what Ambrose had built in 1898. The waterwheel was repaired in original white oak, hand-cut by a cooper in southern Quebec who still worked with the traditional tools. The 2 great grinding stones were cleaned, documented, and preserved behind protective non-reflective glass, with a small brass plaque explaining what each of them had done and how they had done it. The loft was rebuilt with reclaimed timber pulled from a collapsed dairy barn in New Hampshire. The stone foundation was sealed with the correct lime mortar rather than modern cement, because Harriet insisted, gently but firmly, that modern cement would eventually split the old stones, and Odessa trusted her. The roof was slated properly for the first time in a century, and the slate came, at Odessa's specific request, from the same small quarry in western Vermont that Ambrose had used in 1898, which had stayed in continuous operation under 3 generations of the same family, and had the original order receipt still framed on their office wall. They added, carefully, the things a working foundation needed. Quiet electricity was run underground from the village so that no lines would ever touch the historic roofline. A modest geothermal heating system was installed beneath the grounds, invisible from a surface. A research library was built on the 2nd level, lined floor to ceiling in white pine shelving, with a long reading table made by a young carpenter in Hollowbrook who had been Micah's Little League coach. Two small guest rooms were fitted into the loft for visiting historians. A commercial-grade kitchen was installed in what had once been the miller's cottage attached to the east wall, so that Geneva could teach the old milling recipes she had been handed down from her grandmother. The sourdough starter that had been alive in her family since 1911, the maple oat bread her great-aunt had baked every Sunday of her life, the apple pan dowdy that nobody under the age of 70 still seemed to know how to make properly. The mill became a place again, a working place, a place with a purpose. A place where, on the right afternoon in late summer, you could sit on the stone step outside the front door and hear the water wheel turning and smell bread baking and watch a group of local schoolchildren learning how grain had once been made into flour and feel, very quietly, that something old had been saved and that something new had been allowed to begin. Odessa hired Geneva Holloway as the Foundation's first full-time director. She hired two young historians, a married couple named Theo and Willibrandt, who had been living in a cramped graduate student apartment in Boston, and she built them a small cottage on the south end of the property with a view of the creek. She created scholarships at the Hollowbrook Regional School for any student pursuing engineering, agriculture, or mechanical design, the three fields closest to Ambrose's own heart, and she endowed them permanently so that they would still be paying out long after she herself was gone. She opened the grinding room to the public on Saturdays, free of charge, and within the first year the mill was receiving more than 4,000 visitors a season, most of them families who had heard the story on a podcast or in a newspaper column, and who brought their children to stand in the room where the vault had been and to look down through a glass floor panel Harriet had installed, at the stone chamber where Ambrose's portfolio had waited for 6 decades. Micah finished his junior year at Ashboro High with a 3.91 grade average and a college application essay about a great-great-great-uncle he had never met, a stone chamber under a Vermont mill, and a grandmother who had taught him that the people who laugh the loudest are almost always the ones who understand the least. He was accepted to the University of Vermont, and then to Cornell, and then to MIT. He chose Cornell because it was closer to home and because he had decided, after one long autumn of thinking about it, that he wanted to study mechanical engineering. His grandfather, he told Odessa over dinner the night he made the decision, had built beautiful things with his hands. His great-great-great-uncle had designed beautiful things for the world. He wanted, he said, to do a little bit of both. Odessa, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table in her second-floor apartment at the mill, reached across and put her hand over his, and for the first time since the morning she had found the chamber, she allowed herself to believe, completely, that the boy was going to be all right. More than all right. That the boy was going to be a man Wendell would have been proud to sit across a table from, and that she, Odessa Marie Whitlock, had done the work she had been left behind to do. She lived comfortably, but simply. She kept a modest apartment on the second floor of the mill, above the library, with a window that looked out over Blackwater Creek and a small writing desk where she wrote letters, to former students who had grown into teachers themselves, to a few old friends scattered across 3 states, to the widow in Cambridge whose forensic accountant had first begun to unravel Malcolm's empire, and with whom she had begun, through a careful exchange of letters, a genuine and unexpected friendship. She gardened. She baked bread in Geneva's commercial kitchen on Tuesday mornings with 2 other women from the village who had become, in a quiet way of late-life friendships, something like sisters. She walked into the village most mornings to have coffee with Geneva and to let the old men at the counter tease her gently about her occasional new cardigan, and about the brass plate on Jonas's truck, and about the fact that Harriet Ashworth had been seen 3 Saturdays in a row having dinner with the widower who ran the bookbinding shop. She read a great deal. She slept well. Malcolm was sentenced in late June to 9 years and 4 months in federal prison. Odessa read about it in the Boston Globe with her morning coffee, folded the paper closed, and went out to weed her tomatoes. Priscilla's divorce was finalized the following September. Reginald Thorne, disbarred the year after for unrelated conduct in 2 separate state cases, retired to a condominium in Florida that he could no longer really afford. Odessa did not take any pleasure in any of it. She did not take any pain from it, either. These were simply facts about people who had once stood across a courtroom from her and who no longer had any power over a single square foot of her life. On the first anniversary of the day she had found the chamber, a clear October Saturday, exactly 1 year after the nor'easter, Odessa held a small dedication ceremony on the stone steps of the restored mill. Reporters came from 2 state papers. A historian came from the Smithsonian. A delegation from the engineering school at Cornell came, partly for Ambrose's patents and partly, she suspected, to have an early look at a certain incoming freshman. Geneva catered the event with apple cake and fresh cider and her grandmother's maple oat bread, still warm from the oven. Jonas ran the tours with the dignified seriousness of a man who had been rehearsing for this day for 40 years without realizing it. Harriet Ashworth stood at the back of the crowd with the bookbinder, both of them pretending, rather unconvincingly, not to be holding hands. And Odessa, standing in front of a small crowd on the stone steps of a mill her brother-in-law had once called the rot heap, with Micah beside her in his first real suit, and Geneva and Jonas and Delaney Park standing in the front row, gave a short speech that ended with a line the Burlington Free Press printed the following morning in large type above the fold. "A year ago, a man who shared my last name laughed when he handed me the deed to this mill. He believed he was handing me ruin. He believed he was handing me a quiet place to grow old and be forgotten. What he was really handing me was my husband's great-uncle's lifetime of quiet, honest work, and the one lesson those quiet, honest men always seem to leave behind for the rest of us. The world overlooks the people who build things for love instead of for applause. The world laughs at the women who are still standing at 69 with nothing in their hands but a grandchild and a promise. But the world does not forget those people, and neither, my friends, does time. Ambrose Whitlock waited 62 years in a stone chamber under this floor to rescue somebody who needed rescuing. I was lucky enough to be the one who lifted the boards. And the only thing I can do with the years I have left is make sure that somebody else someday is lucky enough to be lifted by what we build here now." The crowd stood and applauded for a long time. Micah, who had grown 2 full inches over the summer and who no longer looked, to Odessa's careful eye, quite like a boy, put his arm around her shoulders and held her there on the stone step while the applause went on and on. Geneva cried without apology. Jonas took his cap off, and somewhere in the back of the crowd, a young reporter from the Burlington Free Press wrote down, in a small black notebook, the sentence that would run above the fold the following morning, and that would be quoted in 3 different books over the next decade, and that would, eventually, be carved in small letters into the stone lintel above the mill's restored front door, where every visitor who walked in would read it as they crossed the threshold. Dreams don't age, and neither do the people who refuse to stop dreaming them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.